I'm Brendan Bechtel. I'm chairman and CEO of the Bechtel Group of companies. I'm also the chair of the Business Roundtable's Infrastructure Committee. And I'm so glad to be here with Secretary Buttigieg, former two-term mayor of South Bend, Indiana, now the 19th U.S. Secretary of Transportation, really outspoken advocate for all things infrastructure, as both a practitioner and now a leader at the federal level. Infrastructure is so important for the nation. The failure to address America's infrastructure needs are costing, in excess of $1,000 a year for most families. A study that the Business Roundtable just put out shows that a $1 trillion investment in infrastructure over the next 10 years would create more than 1 million jobs by 2030 and provide the average American family with more than $1,800 in disposable income every year for the next 20 years. I'm so glad to say it's such a high priority for the Biden administration and for the secretary. So let's start our first question with talking about why it's a top priority. Why is this such a high priority for you and for the administration?
Well, thanks for first of all, this conversation. And as you said, there's an enormous need here. And with that comes an enormous opportunity. So the president's vision is a jobs plan that addresses the fact that we've got, similarly by my department's estimation, about $1 trillion backlog of needed repairs. We've fallen to 13th in the world in infrastructure, in a country that is accustomed rightly to being number one, and that we need to make some decisions if we want to maintain a leadership position around the world, but also if we want to continue growing the economy here at home. We can't keep coasting off of infrastructure investments and decisions that were made a generation ago or more. So the vision is to create jobs through investments in those basics of what it takes for Americans to thrive, and to expand our imagination about what infrastructure means. Every great moment in American infrastructure challenged a little bit some of the old definitions. The transcontinental railroad would have seemed like a very new and questionable technology early on. Of course, now it's as traditional as it gets. The interstate highway system was more visionary than we might remember. And by the same token, we think going into the 2020s, being connected to the internet is as important as being connected to the interstate highway system, which is why it's in the plan to get every American an internet, a fast, reliable, and affordable internet connection. So we view all of these things as connected and view this moment we're living in as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity because of the public interest and the bipartisan appetite to get something done.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Let's talk a little bit about business and labor and how we can come together to help do something exciting on infrastructure. So, I talk to business leaders, I talk to labor leaders. Everyone I talk to agrees that infrastructure needs to be upgraded here in the U.S. How can we, and how do you think we should work together with you to help make this a reality?
Well, if we get this right, then everybody is going to be better off. The business opportunities are enormous. Certainly the opportunities for creating good paying union jobs are enormous. And the benefit to ordinary Americans who are paying that up to $1,000 that you mentioned, just in terms of what's called, for example, the invisible pothole tax, just the wear and tear on people's vehicles, just to take one example. Addressing all of that at once, I think, is what we can be doing right now. And we welcome this as a kind of a national project that engages workers, that engages business leadership, that engages the academy. The R&D elements of this plan aren't being talked about as much, but this is a moment where we can really drive the kind of basic research that will help a further generation of investments succeed. And we could be doing more as a country when it comes to mobilizing private capital in order to be part of the solution in many ways too. So often we've been at our best when working side by side with state and local government and with the private sector. You look at things like private activity bonds, a very successful program which has already reached its cap in terms of the authorization. Things like TIFIA that has provided $32 billion of assistance since 1998, but with leverage to unlock so much more. So this is a season for creativity, and I think it's a season for partnership with business leaders, with workers across the country, and with state, local, tribal, territorial governments, so that we're all pulling in the same direction.
Secretary, I might shift now to this notion of shovel-ready versus shovel-worthy projects, and I'm really excited about this because I heard Brian Deese talking in a podcast about not just shovel-ready but also shovel-worthy projects. And these are the projects that take years and years, as you know from your time as a mayor, to plan, to thoughtfully prepare. And in often cases, the highest economic impact projects are the ones that take a long time to thoughtfully plan. Can you tell us a bit more about how the administration, you are thinking about this juxtaposition of the need to get people back to work right away as much as we can, but also to take the kind of commitment needed for these shovel-worthy projects? How's that guiding your vision at DOT, for example?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, the phrase shovel ready, I think, entered most of our vocabulary in the context of the 2009 stimulus, responding to that economic crisis with investments that were designed for short-term, or I should say immediate economic impact. Now, that's definitely part of what we think we can achieve is immediate economic impact, because there are so many projects in the pipeline, well thought through, sometimes fully engineered, and the only reason they haven't gotten done is the lack of funding. But we're very excited about what we call shovel-worthy projects, because this vision of a jobs plan, this isn't just about getting us through the business cycle, getting us through the quarter, or getting us through the next year. This is about making sure America wins the era that we're living in. And that means sometimes supporting projects that are in a pre-development phase, where we could be supporting that path from shovel-worthy to shovel-ready. That's something that we believe there's a role for policy to help make happen. And if we get that right, then what we're also doing is we're conceiving these transformational projects in ways that are going to make sense for the long run. But the right answer for a piece of infrastructure, let's say a bridge, just to take one example, that's going to be there in the 2050s, might be different than the right answer was if you had been building it in the 1950s. We know that things are changing around us in terms of technology, in terms of climate, in terms of how these assets are going to be used. We're entering a more multimodal future where we ought to be thinking about cars and pedestrians and bicycles and boats and transit and everything in between, all at the same time. And we can only do that if we're ready to really invest in that imagination, that pre-development stage. So there's no shortage of things in the pipeline that can happen as soon as the funding is cleared. But I want to make clear, this vision is not just about stimulus. This vision is about positioning America for long-term competitiveness in the same way, by the way, that competitors to the US are doing. China's not hesitating to think in long-term planning and spend accordingly. A lot of our allies in Europe think this way, and the US at our best has thought in these long-term ways. It's time to do that once more here in the US.
Secretary, if I know there's a lot of mayors and governors out there right now who are really excited to see you in this federal leadership role. And so a question about state and local government and how you think federal action and federal funding on infrastructure in a big way, how do you envision the federal government working with local and state governments to address the infrastructure shortfall and the opportunity that I think there's a lot of alignment on here? But can you talk a little bit from your experience as a mayor and now at a federal level, how do you see that relationship and partnership working?
Yeah, when I was a mayor, I believed that it was at the local level that things really get done. And now that I'm a federal administration official, I believe that even more strongly, because I see how the work actually flows out. We make decisions in Washington, but ultimately the people who have to get it done are those who are nearer to the ground. Now, there's some things we're doing right now with programs like the routes program. So this is an initiative to help with rural transportation infrastructure and support project sponsors that maybe aren't from cities that are big enough to have a full-time federal relations person on staff. And you shouldn't have to in order to navigate the processes that get dollars out to communities that can use them. Then we have the RAISE program, and this has gone through a few name changes in its lifetime. You'll remember Tiger grants, then they were Build grants. Now we're calling it RAISE, Rebuilding America's Infrastructure with Sustainability and Equity. And the idea here is to create high quality projects in communities that are small and large, rural and urban, and to work directly with the communities that are trying to get it done. Another thing that we see a lot of state and local players doing is a focus on safety, which is our #1 mission as a department. things like Vision Zero plans that envision what it would take to get to zero fatalities on our roadways. And we have a Safe Streets for All program that's contemplated in the jobs plan that would help grow that. The bottom line is that the solutions and the answers don't all have to come from Washington, but more of the resources should. And that's the way we're trying to gear the department's existing resources. And it's a very important element of how the American Jobs Plan is shaped. We want to be the most user-friendly possible federal agency for state and local and tribal and territorial governments to work with. And just one last point I'll make. You know, it's at the local level that you see a lot of different disciplines come together. For example, a mayor doesn't think about housing one week and then deal with transportation the next. When you're doing a development, you got to think about how both fit together. But the executive branch org chart is not always designed for that. So I've been working a lot with Secretary Fudge and HUD talking about things like transit-oriented development, working a lot with Secretary Granholm and the Department of Energy, because these EVs that we're excited about are only as clean as the energy that goes into them, and we're going to need a grid that supports them. All of these issues we're talking about, they have an exquisitely interagency character to them. Local players often understand that because they're forced to. We got to make sure that's reflected here in our federal work as well.
That's the perfect segue, Secretary, into the next question about sustainability and climate. So the Business Roundtable believes that addressing the causes of climate change is critical not only to our environment, but also to our economy. That's why last year, the Business Roundtable endorsed the goals of the Paris Treaty, and why so many of the member companies of the Business Roundtable are actively reducing their carbon footprints and reporting on their progress. So as we partner to work on modernizing the nation's infrastructure, how can we also address the climate challenge?
Well, first, I want to applaud the Business Roundtable for taking climate seriously in this way. We are way past the point where we can sit around having arcane debates about whether this is an issue. And you see it on the bottom line. You know, certainly you see it from people in the insurance industry who assess risk for a living, telling us in no uncertain terms what we're up against if we allow the business as usual scenarios to play out. So whenever I hear folks saying, well, you know, you should be doing transportation, not climate, to me, that's like saying, you know, you should put a lot of work into this restaurant you want to open up, but I don't want to hear anything about health or cleanliness. They go together. They're inseparable. Every transportation policy decision is a climate decision, whether we admit it or not. Now, the good news is that this isn't just a matter of containing risk and abating harm. This is a matter of creating opportunity. Not only is there, as again, folks in industry have computed, a terrifying cost to allowing things to continue, but there's a really compelling advantage to shifting that trajectory to a better place. The jobs that we can create, which by the way are not just the sort of maybe exotic or futuristic seeming things that people imagine when they hear the phrase green jobs, but jobs that exist today and we could just use more of them. I'm thinking about electrical workers and insulators and carpenters who are going to be needed on these building retrofits and charger installations. I'm thinking about the auto workers who are going to make the vehicles of tomorrow. I'm thinking about the people who are going to be involved in laying fiber and laying track. You know, these are the kinds of blue collar jobs that we know when we support them, they in turn support whole communities because they're good paying jobs with a future that can't be offshored, that are available to people whether you get a college degree or not. And so that's a vision that we really seek to double down on, and we welcome an increased awareness in the business community that this is smart for the bottom line, as well as simply the right thing to do for our future.
And Secretary, another key priority for the administration in the approach to infrastructure is equity. And this is something that the business community also recognizes as a key priority. So upgrading the nation's infrastructure presents a real opportunity to build a more equitable future together. At the Business Roundtable, we've been particularly focused on broadband policy and broadband investment as one way to do that, but it's not the only kind of infrastructure asset that could be used to build a more equitable future together. How do you see this from your role? You know, what can those of us in the infrastructure community do to help make sure that everyone benefits from these investments in infrastructure?
Thanks for raising this. We think it's critically important, and we think there's a huge opportunity here. Look, the truth is that U.S. transportation policy has been mixed at best from an equity perspective. Often communities have been left out completely of the kinds of transit or other investments that would connect people to opportunity, connect them to jobs, connect them to educational benefits. Other times, investment has arrived in a very harmful way, like a highway that has mowed down a black neighborhood, or a railway or highway that serves to physically segregate a community. It's not an accident that the very metaphor, which is very racialized, of wrong side of the tracks, is a transportation metaphor. I'm not raising this in order to create an atmosphere of guilt. I'm raising this to point to the fact that we have a chance to do it differently this time. By making the kinds of investments that will help communities thrive. In fact, the jobs plan calls for a Thriving Communities initiative, and so does our budget request this year. That helps make sure that we're reconnecting places that may have been made worse off by policy choices in the past. But this isn't just a question about where investments go, it's a question of business opportunity. And everyone from the workers on a site to the owners of the companies, contractors and subs when it comes to federal procurement, and businesses in general getting this opportunity, need to reflect the taxpayer, need to reflect the diversity of the country that's funding all of this in the first place. That's going to take some intention, and it's going to require us to be focused on outcomes. These things can be counted, they can be measured, and we can hold ourselves more accountable for whether dollars are going out in an equitable fashion. We can't do it alone, and we're really relying on the business community to take proactive steps. And I know that this has been a subject of conversation, especially in the last year. And I've seen some material commitments, which now, much like the plans that we're making, we'll find a much more specific form. We'll have to, and we want to stay in touch, hand in hand, as those unfold, because we've got to make sure with the amount of investment that we're contemplating, that this time around, it serves only to promote and never to diminish equity.
Thank you, Secretary. I've got one more sort of topical question before I then give you a chance to make any closing remarks you'd like. You've mentioned it before, but private investment and the role of private investment in investing in the nation's future when it comes to infrastructure. The Business Roundtable's assessment is that there's somewhere between $300 and $350 billion of private capital that could be invested in U.S. infrastructure over the next 5 years if the business and policy climate is right. Think of pension funds, think of insurance companies, think of big infrastructure investors from other parts of the financial sector. Do you see this as a priority for how we approach infrastructure investment and policy? If so, what can we do to work together to help unlock this private investment and put it to work for all Americans?
We welcome the conversation about how to better mobilize sources of capital that can be part of the solution. There's no shortage of need, and there's no shortage of chances for a win-win on a triple bottom line that's economic, social, and environmental. Of course, we have to do it in a way that is consistent with public policy goals, that is always reinforcing and never at the expense of what we care about as a country and as an administration with regard to environmental, labor, and other imperatives. But there's a lot of evidence that it can be done. Again, some evidence from existing programming that we could build on here at the Department of Transportation, things like our private activity bonds program. There's evidence from overseas, European partners who are certainly not known for shorting environmental or labor concerns, but who have frankly been more nimble than the US sometimes in finding responsible ways to unlock that private capital. So we think that's something that we should continue exploring and discussing, again, provided that we're holding ourselves accountable to those fundamental public policy goals that explain why often we really do need these public goods to be in public hands.
Thank you, Secretary. Final opportunity for you to offer anything else that we haven't had a chance to cover with a question. I think there's probably a lot of people watching this who are particularly interested in your vision for the DOT going forward and the role it could play in all this, but really open-ended opportunity for you to emphasize anything else we didn't already cover.
Well, let me just emphasize my excitement about the moment that we're in. Here in the department, our focus is safety, equity, climate, job creation for the future, and transformation, knowing that the 2020s, just as a decade, may be remembered as one of the most transformative and dynamic in a very long time in America's story of how we get around and how we safely move people and goods around the country, around communities, and around the world. we've got a moment on our hands that we're going to be remembering for the rest of our lives. And when it's over, we'll wish we had it back. So let's make the absolute most of this moment. And let's continue waving the flag for why infrastructure is not something to say we'll get around to someday. It's something to do now. It's something to do in big, bold ways. And it's something we can take an enormous amount of pride in if we get it right.